It is the first time since the crisis in 2008 that the banking system has seen such a difficult situation. Many banks have failed over the last month, and imagine that just 3 of them combined were managing more than $900 billion. Almost 1 trillion, which if you think about it, it is almost the 5% of the annual United States GDP. And this is something absurd, which has to be controlled if we don't want to have a crisis like in the 2008. So let's see together what has happened, how it can impact us, and what we can do to reduce the risk to the minimum. So it all started on the 8th of March with Silicon Valley Bank, which was the 16th biggest bank in the United States thanks to its enormous growth over the last years. And imagine that it is the second biggest bank to ever fail. This is a bank that was focused on tech startups, as the Silicon Valley name says, and 50% of the venture capitalists in the Silicon Valley had interests in this company, in this bank. And something also very important about this story is how did the SVB grow in the last years. And it is because over the past years, the tech startups were doing extremely well. They were receiving a lot of funds. What they were doing was to pile up their cash, their money, in a Silicon Valley Bank. And so what do banks do when they have cash? They invest it to make more money, which is something totally normal thanks to the fractional reserve banking, which requires to every bank that at least 10% of their assets is liquid in order to be able to face a situation where multiple clients want their money. And what SVB did was to invest this cash in bonds, which are actually the safest investment you could do. And so everything that SVB did for the moment seems totally correct. So what happened? Why did they fail? It is actually a chain of events that brought to this point. Firstly, the war in Ukraine. You know, with the war in Ukraine, there is a great inflation in the whole world right now, for which the central banks are increasing the interest rates. And what does this mean? It is that the bonds are losing their value, which in the case of SVB meant a loss of $17 billion. Moreover, the tech startups, as the whole ecosystem, wasn't doing super good lately, and that's why they needed some cash from the bank to continue their operations. And so they started taking back the money that they piled up during COVID. But all this money was actually now blocked in the bonds for 5 years. And since that this was clearly not gonna make it, SVB took the decision to sell part of their bonds at a loss of 1.8 billion. And this is something that immediately worried all the venture capitalists that had their startups with money in this bank. And so they called the startups and asked them to take their money out of SVB as a precaution. Imagine that because of that, in one single day, SVB had requests for withdrawals of $42 billion. And because of this immense amount of withdrawals requested, SVB didn't have the cash, or at least the liquidity, to give them to their clients. And that's why on the 10th of March, SVB had to declare bankrupt. And so a great discussion about all that started, especially around the fact that the FDIC is actually insuring money in the banks for everyone that has money in an insured bank. But this is limited to $250,000. And as you can imagine, startups don't only have $250K in their banks. And that's why 97% of the money in SVB wasn't insured, which represents more than $150 billion. And so, as you can understand, this is an enormous hole in the startup ecosystem, which could bring to a crisis in the startups world, which would for sure impact the whole economical system. That's why during the weekend, the US government reassured all the population, saying that they would insure all the depositors. So everybody that had money in this bank will be insured and will get their money back in just a couple of days. And this yes helped a lot to contain the crisis, but the fear, the panic, the lack of trust in banks was already spreading all over the world. And in every country, there were people trying to withdraw their money from the bank because they weren't trusting anymore their bank. And this led just a couple of days later to the bankruptcy of 2 other banks, Silvergate and Signature. Imagine that a bank like Credit Suisse, which is one of the biggest and the most historical institutions in the world, had to be bought by UBS, their biggest rival, because they didn't have any more cash. And it is clear that this banking crisis has impacted the whole world over the last month. But now let's understand if there is actually an impact on people like us. And talking about this, the first question is, Is it possible that my bank will face the same problems? And the answer is probably no. Because what happened in SVB, it's actually a very specific case. Because firstly, it is a bank that was investing only in tech startups. Secondly, they invested all their money in bonds and they didn't diversify. Thirdly, the Ukraine war, it's not something that arrives all the time, and that's what caused the loss in value of the bonds. And fourthly, everybody started to withdraw their money at the same time, which is also something that is not really probable. So that's why, thanks to the intervention of the different governments of the central banks, all the crisis situation has been contained. Clearly, the economical system right now is in a difficult situation because of the Ukraine war, now also because of this banking crisis. But the situation right now looks more stable than before because the withdrawals at banks have decreased and they are now more stable. And so now what can you do about that, and especially what can you learn from that? And the first thing is that diversifying and having liquid assets is incredibly important. Because yes, now it happened to a bank, but a crisis could happen to anyone. You might have a problem with your house and you might need some liquidity. And if you don't have it, you might have to sell your investments at loss, as a Silicon Valley bank did. Secondly, I think that you have to choose your bank properly. Is it insured by the FDIC or not? Clearly, I would say that it is better if you're in a bank that is insured. And thirdly, if you have more than $250,000 in your bank account, don't keep it in a small or regional bank because it is more probable for them to be impacted by a potential crisis in the banking system. Whereas the big banks have now the assets, the liquidity and the diversification to overcome this crisis, since as we see in all these cases, they are helping the economy, they are helping all these little banks to overcome this situation. So to conclude, I don't think we have to worry to have a situation like the crisis in 2008. Clearly, it's not the most favorable economic moment, but right now the situation looks much more stable than before. Banks and government are preparing for that since they've already seen what could happen. And what we have in control is to really be attentive on where we have our money so that we can reduce all the risks in a potential crisis situation. And also, all this situation opens up to a lot of questions that I believe will be discussed in the future. So firstly, should the FDIC increase their insurance? Should it be differentiated between businesses and people? And is it okay for the US government to help in such a situation? These are all questions that are extremely difficult to answer. But if you want to know how to face a potential crisis, watch this video, and thank you for watching.